When I was 27, I decided to take a solo trip to Prague. I had always wanted to visit the city, and I thought it would be the perfect destination to explore on my own. I booked a small, cozy Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city center. It was a charming little apartment on the top floor of an old building, with a great view of the cobblestone streets below. The first couple of days went smoothly. I spent my time wandering through the historic streets, visiting landmarks like the Charles Bridge and Prague Castle, and enjoying the local food. On the third evening, I decided to have dinner at a small restaurant I had passed earlier in the day. It was tucked away in a narrow alley, and the warm glow of the lights inside made it look inviting. The restaurant was quiet, with only a few other patrons scattered around. I took a seat near the window and ordered a traditional Czech dish. As I waited for my food, I noticed a man sitting alone at a table across the room. He looked to be in his late 40s, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. I didn't think much of him at first, but I caught him glancing in my direction a few times. I brushed it off, assuming he was just bored or people watching. When my food arrived, I focused on eating and enjoying my meal. But every now and then, I could feel his eyes on me. It started to make me uncomfortable, so I avoided looking in his direction. After I finished eating, I asked for the check and quickly paid. As I got up to leave, the man stood up as well. He didn't follow me immediately, but I could feel his presence as I walked out of the restaurant and into the dimly lit alley. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as I turned onto the main street, I glanced back and saw him a short distance behind me. My heart started to race. I picked up my pace, weaving through the streets and taking random turns to try to lose him. Each time I looked back, he was still there, keeping a steady distance. When I finally reached my Airbnb, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I peeked out the window, but I didn't see him anywhere. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I double-checked all the locks and closed the curtains before heading to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the old building creaking, but then I heard it again, a soft tapping sound, like someone trying to open a window. My stomach dropped. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crept toward the living room. The tapping was coming from the window near the fire escape. I peeked through the edge of the curtain and saw the man from the restaurant standing on the fire escape, trying to pry the window open. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the local emergency number. I whispered to the operator, explaining the situation as best as I could. They assured me that help was on the way. I stayed hidden in the bedroom, clutching a heavy lamp as a makeshift weapon, just in case. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I heard the sound of sirens outside. I peeked out the window and saw the man climbing down the fire escape, trying to get away. The police arrived just in time to catch him at the bottom of the stairs. The officers questioned me and searched the apartment to make sure everything was safe. They told me the man had tools on him, likely intending to break in. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't woken up in time still haunts me. I cut my trip short and flew home the next day. While I still love traveling, that experience taught me to always be extra cautious, especially when traveling alone. I haven't been back to Prague since. It was the middle of summer, and most of my friends were out of town. I decided to pick up a part-time job to keep myself busy and earn some extra cash. After a few days of searching, I got a call from a small convenience store on the edge of town. They needed someone to cover the late-night shift, and I figured it wouldn't be too bad. The owner seemed nice enough, and the pay was decent, so I accepted. The store itself was old and a bit rundown. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the aisles were cramped and dusty. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but I told myself it was only temporary. My shift started at 9 p.m. and ended at 3 a.m., and most nights were uneventful. A few customers would trickle in here and there, but for the most part, it was quiet. One night, around 1 a.m., I was restocking shelves when I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He wasn't coming in, just standing there, staring through the glass doors. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a tattered jacket. Something about him made me uneasy. I tried to ignore him and continued with my work, but every time I glanced toward the door, he was still there, watching. After about 10 minutes, he finally came inside. He didn't grab a basket or look at any of the shelves. Instead, he wandered aimlessly around the store, his eyes darting toward me every so often. I tried to stay calm and focused on my tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was up to something. Eventually, he approached the counter. He didn't have anything to buy, just stood there, staring at me with a crooked smile. "Quiet night, huh?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded politely, trying to keep the interaction short. "You work here alone?" he asked, leaning on the counter. My stomach tightened. I lied and said, "No, my coworker is in the back." He chuckled softly, as if he didn't believe me. After a few moments of silence, he turned and walked out of the store. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and tried to shake off the encounter. But the unease lingered. I kept glancing at the security cameras, half expecting to see him lurking outside again. Around 2:30 a.m., I started closing up. I locked the front doors and began counting the register. The store was silent except for the hum of the refrigerators in the back. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping sound. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back door. I slowly made my way to the rear of the store, my hands trembling. The back door had a small window, and as I got closer, I saw him. The man from earlier was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, grinning. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, his eyes locked on mine. Panic set in. Panic. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The man didn't move, just kept staring and tapping. I backed away, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. The man started jiggling the door handle, his grin widening as he realized it was locked. I could hear him mumbling something, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart was racing, and I was certain he was going to break in. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car through the front windows. The man must have seen them too because he bolted, disappearing into the darkness. The officers searched the area but didn't find him. They escorted me home and advised me to be cautious. I quit the job the next day. The owner was understanding, though disappointed. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone. The man's face, his grin, the way he stared, it's burned into my memory. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never work a night shift again. I was 20 and working a part-time job at a small gas station just outside of town. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills while I was in school. The station was open 24 hours, and I usually worked the evening shift, which ran from 4 p.m. to midnight. It was usually quiet after 10 p.m., with only the occasional trucker or late-night traveler stopping by. One night, around 11:30 p.m., a man came in. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He grabbed a soda and a bag of chips, then came up to the counter. He smiled at me, but there was something about his eyes that made me uneasy. They lingered on me a little too long. "Slow night?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded politely, trying to keep the interaction short. "Yeah, pretty quiet." He handed me a $10 bill, and as I gave him his change, his hand brushed mine. It felt intentional, but I didn't say anything. He stood there for a moment, just staring at me, before finally walking out. I watched him through the window as he got into an old beat-up truck and drove off. I felt a little unsettled, but I brushed it off. Weird customers weren't exactly uncommon. The next night, I was working the same shift. Around the same time, 11:30 p.m., the same man came in. This time, he didn't buy anything. He just walked around the store, glancing at me every so often. I pretended to be busy stocking shelves behind the counter, hoping he'd leave. After a few minutes, he finally walked out without saying a word. When I went to lock up at midnight, I noticed his truck parked across the street, just sitting there with the headlights off. My stomach dropped. I quickly locked the doors, got in my car, and drove home, checking my rearview mirror the entire way. Thankfully, I didn't see him following me. The next few nights were uneventful, and I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. But then, A week later, he came back. This time, he didn't even try to pretend he was there to shop. He walked straight up to the counter and leaned in close. "You're here alone every night, huh?" he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I forced a smile and stepped back. "Not always. My manager's in the back," I lied. He smirked, like he didn't believe me. "Well, maybe I'll see you around." He left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Sure enough, when I looked out the window, his truck was parked in the same spot across the street. I called my manager, who told me to lock the doors and stay inside until my shift ended. I did as he said, but the man didn't leave. He stayed there, just sitting in his truck, until I saw the morning shift worker pull into the parking lot. Only then did he drive off. I told my manager everything, and he promised to install security cameras and have someone else work the late shifts with me. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. But then, one night, I found a note taped to the door when I arrived for my shift. It was written in messy, almost childlike handwriting. "Can't wait to see you again. You're even prettier when you're scared." I froze, my heart pounding. I showed the note to my manager, who called the police. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do without knowing who the man was. They told me to be careful and to call them if I saw him again. A few nights later, I was closing up when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, but when I looked out the window, I didn't see anyone. I quickly locked the doors and turned off the lights, hoping to make it look like no one was inside. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the building. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything. I decided that night would be my last shift. I quit the next day and found a new job in a different part of town. A few weeks later, I got a call from the police. They'd caught the man after he tried to break into another gas station late at night. When they searched his truck, they found a notebook filled with disturbing notes about me. Things he'd written about watching me, following me home, and even plans to take me away. I still get chills thinking about how close I came to being one of his victims. To this day, I never work late night shifts, and I always make sure to keep my doors locked.